Hi, I'm Dr. Rachel Kowert. I am a research psychologist who's been studying the uses and effects of games for more than 10 years. I am also the host of this YouTube channel, Zeitgeist, where I talk about the science of games. And part of my mission with this channel is to share some of the scientific information and presentations that I make for other groups here with you guys. And that's what I'm doing today in this talk about the gamification of violence. Now, this talk was created on behalf of my work at Take This. For those who don't know about Take This, I am the research director there. We are a mental health nonprofit that serves the gaming industry and gaming communities. We aim to destigmatize mental health challenges by providing mental health information and support to game makers and game players. So the gamification of violence is kind of a buzzword that we hear going around lately. And generally, there are two ways to think about this concept. First, the way that games are being leveraged by extremist groups to mobilize real-world violence. And second, the adoption of gamification or game-like elements to real-world acts of violence. Now, this second point, the adoption of gamification or game-like elements to real-world acts of violence, is not my area of expertise. However, it is a really important discussion to have because we have long discredited the violent video games make you violent dialogue because research doesn't support it. We see this picture here. This is of Death Race, which is one of the first games that was pegged as a murder simulator. But we know that the moral panic in and around games and violent video games continues well into today, 2022. But we also know that media effects in terms of a behavior in, media out, a direct connection between violent video gameplay and violent real-world behavior is not a thing. But there is room to have a discussion about the role of content and game mechanics and the way that we are seeing the gamification of violence through the adoption of game-like elements into real-world acts of violence, because we are seeing that. One example comes from the Christchurch shootings of New Zealand from 2019, I believe. This is a piece here from GNet, and it discusses the gamification of behavior with this particular attack through their intentionally constructed manifesto, through the use of live streaming video, gamifying audience reaction, and incorporating various game design elements. As you see in this quote, it was very much like a let's play in which the gun was decorated. It was about the way the assailant was moving, the use of multiple weapons, the visual choreography, so to say, reflected game-like elements. So there really is a growing interest now in the ways in which we can look at the gamification of violence through this lens of games. There's a really good article about this called Press F to Pay Respects that I highly recommend, really outlining this idea of gamification of violence. So that's one area. The other growing area is the way that games are being leveraged by extremist groups, to mobilize real-world violence. Now, this is my area of expertise, so I'd like to talk a bit about this, specifically in relation to what we know about the current state of the research, current research trends, and key policy changes and recommendations that we can take away. So we know that games are being leveraged for radicalization and recruitment of extremist actors and activities. Alex Newhouse from the Middlebury Institute and I gave a talk about that at GDC 2022. It is available in the vault. I'm happy to send you a link to that talk if you're interested in deep diving into that. But for now, let's just say we know that it is happening and there's ample evidence. We also know that games are spaces with particular vulnerabilities to these activities due to the social nature and interactive and playful nature of them. One, we have the unique ways in which social relationships are formed through games. They're formed through shared playful activities. They are socially reinforced, and this leads to the formation of close, long-lasting, tight-knit social bonds. There's also othering processes in games, the idea that there's an us versus them, which reinforces the dynamics of radicalization, and this as these ideas are often rooted in us versus them dynamics. Words. And three, the culture and identity of games. Toxic gamer cultures permeate gaming spaces. They are typically more associated with exclusion than inclusion. And this can further solidify these us versus them dynamics, but also means that games can be leveraged as a social space where hate is normalized, which is something we're starting to see in the research. A new report published by the Anti-Defamation League in collaboration with Take This, Middlebury Institute, and GamerSafer found evidence for the normalization of hateful and extremist language in gaming spaces, looking at more than 1.4 million chat messages across 3 Minecraft servers. We found the presence of slurs previously only affiliated with extreme groups, white nationalist groups, and hate groups specifically, suggesting the normalization of extreme language in gaming spaces. Interestingly, we also found that hateful language was 21% more likely to be shared in public chat than private chat, whereas the opposite was found for sexualized language, which is more likely to be shared in private chat than public chat, again pointing to this idea of a normalization and acceptance of hate speech embedded in gamer cultures. Now, independently, these unique factors of vulnerability, they are important. But taken together, we're creating a space where hate is normalized and radicalization, recruitment, mobilization goes largely unmoderated, at least not effectively moderated in any sort of way. So let's talk about key research trends. So a couple trends we're starting to see in this area. First is the discussion of games as different than, these unique vulnerabilities. Understanding the ways in which gaming networks are being leveraged and how it is not the same as the way that other spaces on the internet is being leveraged is really key to looking at this landscape and understanding how to best combat these effects and how they are happening in the first place, why they are happening in the first place. The other trend we're starting to see take shape in discussions about gamification of violence is the role of social identity and cultural norms. So, for example, going back to that ADL report about Minecraft, one of the primary findings in that report as well was that server guidelines, the cultural norms that were set by the server guidelines, were more effective in the long term than moderation intervention at shaping the nature of the server itself. So whether it had more or less hateful and harassing language. So understanding the role of cultural norms and identity, I think, is really going to be key in moving these discussions forward about extremism in games specifically. Further speaking to the role of identity and culture, just wanted to touch a little bit on some recent work that I've been doing in collaboration with Alexi Martel and Bill Swan at the University of Texas, looking at the role of identity fusion. So identity fusion is related to social identity. Typically we have our personal identity, the I's, and our social identities, the we's, and these tend to be separate, but sometimes they fuse together. And when they fuse together, that's called identity fusion. Now, identity fusion is interesting because when fusion happens, an individual is more willing to enlist their personal self in sacrifice or in service of the group. So you're more willing to make personal sacrifices for group goals. Now, fusion research has typically focused on groups like nationalist groups or military groups. Once a Marine, always a Marine is the perfect example. My father was a Marine, and if you've ever met one, their personal identity and their identity as a Marine, very fused. There's no teasing out the two. So we looked at identity fusion in gamer cultures, and we found not only that fusion does exist in gamer cultures, but the fusion reflects the toxic nature of these communities. So specifically, identity fusion with gamer cultures was found to be associated with the willingness to fight or die. This is the element of self-sacrifice. This is the element of fusion. Recent aggressive behaviors, Machiavellianism, which is a personality trait characterized by interpersonal manipulation, being deceitful and lacking morality, narcissism, psychopathy, sexism, racism, and it says here alt-right identity, but it should really read white nationalism identity because the questions were about espousing extremist beliefs associated specifically with the white nationalist movement. We also found that the toxic nature of the gaming space itself influences the way in which fusion presents itself with gaming. So looking at fusion and extreme outcomes among Call of Duty versus Minecraft players, we found that the levels of antisocial and prosocial sentiments across players was the same in averages, but when you look through the lens of fusion, it predicted greater social toxicity among the Call of Duty players and greater social positivity among the Minecraft players. So basically, this profile was more magnified and more prevalent among the Call of Duty players, whether it's from the more toxic social environment, which is our hypothesis, might also have to do with the competitive nature of the game. We need a little more research to kind of tease out those elements specifically. It's also worth noting that age, gender, and years gaming did not predict this profile, but gameplay time did. And again, we hypothesize this has less to do with content, and more to do with being entrenched in the social environment, a toxic social environment. So I want to end today with some policy directions, some food for thought. First, increasing researcher access to data. Granting researchers and watchdogs with access to data will help us identify and address challenges for hateful, harassing, and toxic behavior in spaces and allow us to figure out how to have a positive social impact. So for policy, this may mean making exceptions or changes to privacy laws to allow greater access to third parties. And also investing in content moderation and robust community guidelines. So as we saw with the ADL report, with the Minecraft data, effective human moderation and community guidelines are both important for reducing hateful language. So perhaps policy on requirements for rates of moderation or requirements on community guidelines. But for me, really, data access is kind of the key. Game companies, are very apprehensive to share because they don't want the bad press, which, right, I get it. And there are also a lot of privacy laws that can be tricky to work around. However, I cannot underestimate the importance of granting third parties access to in-server data. That's how we did the work with Gamer Safer, and that's how we're going to move the needle forward. So thank you. I hope you enjoyed this talk. Here are the different places that you can find me on the web, and I'm happy to continue these discussions. Thank you.